have some visual aids. Yeah. Okay, can you see my screen now?
It's still loading. Yeah, we can see your screen. It's on the first slide.
Okay, good. Okay. Well, let me first thank Lucas for the invitation. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in virtual space, as it were, and of course to Hasok for agreeing to respond to my talk. I will be talking about integrated history and philosophy of science, and the debates on this topic have focused, for the most part, on the relevance of historical case studies to the philosophy of scientific development. But here I would like to discuss the converse question, namely, how can philosophical reflection on science enrich the historical understanding of past scientific practice? Here is an outline of the talk. I will start with suggesting that there is a spectrum of ways to integrate history and philosophy of science, and that this spectrum has two poles, two ideal types, as it were: historical philosophy of science on the other hand, on the one hand, and philosophical history of science on the other hand. So to rephrase my initial question, I will ask how we can practice PHS, philosophical history of science. I will argue that this question can be addressed at two levels. First, at the meta-historical level, where philosophical analysis can be brought to bear on the elucidation of historiographical problems, such as the elusive object of history of science. And second, at the level of particular case studies, where philosophical insights into, for example, scientific discovery, experimentation, and epistemic values can be deployed in the service of narrative construction and historical interpretation. I find very interesting that what I will be talking about has a considerable overlap both with Hans-Jörg's talk and with Peter Berg's talk. That was completely unintentional. I had no idea what they were going to talk about. Now, in an earlier paper, I drew a distinction between two ways of integrating history and philosophy of science, what I call historical philosophy of science and philosophical history of science. I have to say that I come from the Anglo-American tradition, and I realize now that a similar distinction was drawn by Kanye Yem, as pointed out by Hans-Jörg. I'm not sure whether my distinction is overlaps with his distinction, but perhaps this is a topic that we can discuss. Now I have somewhat revised my views on this distinction. I think that there is a whole spectrum of ways to integrate history and philosophy of science that extends between these two poles. But let me first explain what these two poles are. The first pole, historical philosophy of science, is a familiar one and investigates epistemological and metaphysical issues such as the rationality of scientific revolutions or the reality of unobservable entities in light of the historical development of the sciences. Influential works in this category include Kuhn's structure, of course, Phil Kitcher's The Advancement of Science, and Michael Friedman's Dynamics of Reason, about which we will hear more in the afternoon. The second way of integrating the two fields, what I call philosophical history of science, has a rather different aim, namely to explore or to reconstruct particular historical episodes or to address historiographical questions by engaging with philosophical issues about, for example, the dynamics of scientific theories, or the processes of conceptual change. Recent works in this category include the two books of Hasok that were mentioned by Lucas, my own book, again kindly mentioned by Lucas, David Bloor's The Enigma of the Aerofoil, which is a wonderful history of aerodynamics from a particular relativist philosophical perspective. Friedrich Steinle's exploratory experiments, and Yuta Sikora's about methods. So HPS and PHS have different goals. The former, HPS, aims at philosophical enlightenment. The aim of HPS, historical philosophy of science, is philosophical, whereas PHS is motivated by historiographical concerns. Now, let me add a qualifier here, and that is a difference with my earlier view that I defended in a few years ago. Some of these works have a double agenda, partly philosophical and partly historical. So take, for example, Hasok's books and Inventing Temperature, for instance. On the one hand, that book aims at investigating philosophical questions about measurement, but at the same time, it aims at telling the story of the concept of temperature. And I choose Hasok's books as an example because Hasok is here and he may correct me if I misinterpret his intentions and his goals in writing that book. And the same is true of the other three books that I have on the slide. So it would be more accurate to say that there is a spectrum of ways of integrating history and philosophy of science, manifesting philosophical analysis and historical reconstruction in different degrees. Be that as it may, for the purposes of this talk, I will put aside the subtleties and focus on PHS, on philosophical history of science, as a form of history without philosophical ambitions, to make my life easier, less complicated. So, as I already mentioned in the beginning of the talk, despite the recent interest in philosophical history of science, if we look at the discussion on the relationship between these two fields in the Anglo-American world, we realize immediately that the discussion has been skewed towards historical philosophy of science. And the focus of the discussion has been the relevance of historical case studies to the generation and appraisal of philosophical claims. Remarkably, I think, and quite revealingly at the same time, historians of science have been conspicuously absent from that debate. So if we look, for instance, at Zamito's 2004 book, A Nice Derangement of Epistemes, which is a history of science studies, chapter 4 of that book provides a detailed account of what Zamito calls the failed marriage of history and philosophy of science. But even that term is rather, I don't want to say optimistic. I mean, how can you be optimistic about a failed marriage? But it doesn't portray accurately the situation. It was never a marriage to begin with. Rather, if I had to frame it in those terms, I would say that it was an unsuccessful attempt by philosophers of science to seduce historians of science. But historians of science have remained largely indifferent to philosophy of science, again in the Anglo-American world, and look to other fields such as anthropology, psychology, and sociology of science for methodological guidance. And it's good that Hans-Jörg's talk preceded mine because he gave you a very nice overview of theoretical works that have influenced the historical community. And most of them didn't come from analytic philosophy of science. So As a result, the prospects and the problems of philosophical history of science have received insufficient attention, and the historiographical potential of philosophical reflection on scientific practice has remained largely unexplored. So, how can we redress this imbalance towards historical philosophy of science? To spell out the added historiographical value of engaging with philosophy of science, my point of departure is an observation that we owe to Norwood Russell Hanson. Historical accounts of past scientific practice involve meta-scientific concepts, such as discovery or experiment, which are not philosophically innocent and require philosophical scrutiny. Even the very concept of science itself carries a great deal of philosophical baggage. So I would like to suggest that philosophical reflection on these concepts, on these meta-scientific concepts, as well as an engagement with epistemological issues in the philosophy of science, can be historiographically fertile. So the aim of philosophical history of science, as I understand it, is first to bring philosophy of science to bear on the critical examination of the historiographical categories that we use, and second, to make historiographical use of philosophical insights into scientific practice. Philosophical insights into scientific practice, if worth their mettle, should assist the historians to write better history. In other words, they should enable them to tell richer, more plausible, and more coherent stories about past scientific life. So to illustrate the first aim of, the first meta-historical aim of PHS, let's consider a seemingly trivial question. What is the history of science the history of? That was the title of a lecture that Peter Deere delivered at an HSS meeting. I think it was in 2004. It was published in ISIS in 2005. And historians of science, including Peter Deere himself and Jan Golinsky, have agonized over this question. Why so? I mean, this seems to be a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. History of science is a branch of history. Nobody would dispute that these days. The subject of which is science. We know what science is. We know how to identify it. So it should be easy to go back in time, identify those activities that merit the honorary title scientific, and bring them back to life, as it were. Now, of course, there are problems with this view. And I don't need to lecture this audience for the problems of this view, but let me just say that the boundaries between science and non-science have been continually shifting. For instance, in the 17th century, non-scientific considerations, non-scientific from our point of view, for example, theological arguments, were directly involved in discussions among natural philosophers on problems such as the mechanical stability of the solar system that we would now consider as scientific. So how can we go about addressing these problems? The first thing we can say is that no simple philosophical definition of science is satisfactory. Philosophers of science have tried their best over decades to define science, but I don't think that there's any definition of science that is unanimously accepted by philosophers of science. So there appears to be no general philosophical solution to our problem. If there is a way out of the problem, it should be sought on a case-by-case basis. Furthermore, this problem does not pertain only to the concept of science, but to most, if not all, concepts within science. So it is an instance of a more general phenomenon, the phenomenon of conceptual change. Take, for instance, the concept of the electron, about which I've done some work back in the early 21st century. That concept changed dramatically from the late 19th century when it appeared. It appeared in physics to, say, the late 1920s. not to mention today. How then can a historian construct a coherent narrative around that concept? To put it another way, if concepts, scientific concepts, do not retain their identity over time, what is their history the history of? So, as I argued in Representing Electron, to answer this question, one has to engage with the extensive philosophical literature on conceptual change and come to terms with the well-known conundrums about meaning change. The historian come philosopher should be able to make the case that there has been sufficient continuity in the meaning and epistemic function of an evolving concept for that concept to qualify as the central subject of a historical narrative. So an engagement with the philosophy of conceptual change seemed to be historiographically necessary, not just an optional move. Let me now move to meta-scientific concepts and historical case studies. I have here three meta-scientific concepts: epistemic values, experimentation, and scientific discovery. I'm not sure if I'll be able to talk about all of them, but we'll see. I will try to talk at least about the first two, epistemic values and experimentation. In 1968, Thomas Kuhn gave a lecture on the relations between the history and the philosophy of science, where he argued for...
There seem to be another two.
I hear someone, perhaps you can switch off your microphones. Okay, thank you. In that lecture, he argued for one-way traffic between the two fields, whereas history of science is relevant, indeed indispensable to philosophical reflection on science. According to Kuhn, the converse is not the case. Kuhn thought that analytic philosophy of science had little, if anything, to offer to the historian of science. Curiously, however, Kuhn did not discuss the potential relevance of his own philosophy of science or that of his fellow historicist philosophers of science to historiographical practice. As a matter of fact, there are philosophical insights in Kuhn's work that have significant historiographical value. And I don't have in mind here the usual suspects, paradigms and scientific revolutions. Rather, I want to focus on a less discussed topic, epistemic values, and argue that Kuhn's reflections on that topic are not only philosophically illuminating, but also historiographically fertile. In a seminal article, Kuhn set the problem of theory choice on a new basis. Rather than conceiving theory choice as a rule-governed process, as was common at the time, he emphasized the role of epistemic values in the appraisal and selection of scientific theories. Kuhn's values were not original. They included empirical accuracy, wide scope, and the cognate value of explanatory power, simplicity, consistency, compatibility with other established theories, and fertility. Kuhn's originality consisted in his suggestion that in practice, the application of those values to the appraisal of scientific theories is extremely complicated. This is due to three reasons. First, those values do not wear their interpretation on their sleeves. Different scientists may interpret them differently. This is most evident in the case of simplicity, which lacks a universally accepted definition. But even in the case of prima facie straightforward values, such as empirical adequacy, disagreements may arise about the degree of accuracy to which a theory should aspire. Second, and more important, the hierarchy of these values, their prioritization by scientists, is not unanimously agreed upon. Some scientists may attach more weight to, say, simplicity than to empirical adequacy, and vice versa. For instance, when the German physicist Walter Kaufmann performed experiments with fast-moving electrons in the early 20th century, his experiments indicated that the variation of the mass of electrons with velocity did not conform to the predictions of Lorentz's electromagnetic theory and the predictions of Einstein's theory of relativity. The reaction of these two scientists was very, very different. Lorentz, for one, thought that his theory had been refuted. Einstein, on the other hand, dismissed Kaufmann's results as indecisive. Stressing the intuitive character and the simplicity of his theory, he considered, quote, its probability is so high that Dr. Kaufmann's results have every chance of being flawed, end quote. Third, in actual scientific life, these values are rarely satisfied unequivocally. Consider, for instance, explanatory power. A theory may do a better explanatory job than its competitors in a certain domain of phenomena, and a worse explanatory job in other domains. According to Kuhn, this is precisely what happened in the chemical revolution. And here's a quote illustrating this. The oxygen theory was universally acknowledged to account for observed weight relations in chemical reactions, something the phlogiston theory had previously scarcely attempted to do. But the phlogiston theory, unlike its rival, could account for the metals being much more alike than the ores from which they were formed. One theory thus matched experience better in one area, the other in another. So from a Kuhnian point of view, from this perspective, one may easily understand the protracted disagreement and controversies that are often found in scientific practice. By taking into account the complex interplay of epistemic values in theory appraisal, those features of scientific life can be plausibly explained as consequences of the epistemic uncertainties that are endemic in science. Now, I have an example here on the Copernican revolution. This doesn't come from Kuhn, but it's my own reconstruction. I was recently teaching the scientific revolution, and I prepared that schematic representation for the students to make them realize how complex that transition was. So on the left, we have Kuhn's values and a comparison of the two systems from the point of view of those values. And we see that it's a very, very complex epistemic situation. The Ptolemaic system has certain advantages and certain defects, and the same is true of the Copernican system. So the question I ask the students is, which system would you have chosen if you were transported in the middle of the 16th century? And I don't think there is a unique correct answer to this question. Both choices would have been rational. Each choice would have been based on a different prioritization of different epistemic values. And as a matter of fact, I think all of these values played a role in the debate at the time, but as a matter of fact, very few astronomers had adopted the Copernican system by the end of the 16th century. And I have here a quote from Floris Cohen's recent book. Until 1600, no more than 11 people have spoken out in favor of Copernicus' revision. And this is small wonder if we take into account how the Copernican system fared with respect to those epistemic values. So both the proponents and the opponents of the Copernican system responded rationally. And this is a retrospective judgment, of course, but I think it does justice to the historical situation. They responded rationally to a deeply uncertain epistemic situation. The space of possibilities delineated by the epistemic values that were prevalent at the time allowed more than one choice. And the particular choices made by particular historical actors within this epistemic space can be explained on the basis of contingent factors related to their biographical and career trajectories. I think I have another 5 minutes, right? So
Yes, you do.
I do. Okay, so I will now move to my next topic. But before I do that, let me say that Kuhn's work indicates that philosophy of science can be historiographically employed in an interpretive rather than a vindicatory mode. Philosophical concepts such as the concept of epistemic values can function as interpretive resources for the historian and help her or him to illuminate the epistemic complexity of the problem situations faced by past scientists. Thus philosophically equipped historians may develop a sympathetic perspective on the losers, the so-called losers of scientific controversies, and come to appreciate the reasons for resisting theoretical novelty and their being left behind by mainstream science. Philosophy of science in the interpretive mode is thus fully compatible with the historical imperative to maintain a critical distance from the scientist's own perspective on the history of their fields, as urged by several historians, including, for example, Paul Forman in his 1991 classic article. So far I have focused on the relevance of philosophy of science to the historical interpretation of theoretical activity. For a long time, philosophy of science, including Kuhn's, was fixated on the theoretical aspects of the scientific enterprise. Happily, the philosophical landscape has now expanded so as to include experimental practice. And here there is an overlap between my talk and Hans Jörg's talk. So as I will suggest very briefly in the next part of the talk, the insights of experimentalist philosophy of science have been indispensable for understanding historically how experimental knowledge is generated, validated, and developed. The philosophy of experiment in contemporary philosophy of science emerged in the early 1980s with the pioneering work of Ian Hacking. We've heard about this from Hans Jörg. And his really innovative perspective, philosophical perspective, has been articulated and quote unquote applied to history of science by other historians and philosophers of science, including Alan Franklin, Peter Gallison, David Gooding, and Friedrich Steinle. Several philosophical insights have come out of that work and proved historiographically fruitful. Three of the most salient are the following. First, philosophers of experiment have emphasized the partial autonomy of experimental science and explored its historiographical ramification. Second, philosophers of experiment have argued that the role of experiment goes well beyond theory testing. Experiments often have an exploratory character and aim at imposing order on a prima facie chaotic domain of phenomena. A third insight of the philosophy of experiment concerns theory. This accordion term has been applied to very different things: phenomenological laws, models of the instruments employed in experimentation, models of the entities investigated or manipulated, deep unifying principles, etc. And this confusion has obscured significantly, the relationship between theory and experiment. And these insights have been particularly significant for my own historical work on experimentation, but I will skip that in the interest of time. I see that we are running out of time, so I will skip the part about discovery and come to my conclusion. I hope to have convinced you that philosophy of science may offer tools for understanding how past scientific episodes unfolded. I have indicated some topics of philosophical discussion that can be fruitfully brought to bear on the history of science. So, if I'm right, integrated HPS as a form of history in in its philosophical history of science mode deserves a chance to grow. It is an approach to history of science where philosophy of science is brought to bear on meta-historical issues and historiographical practice. But, and this is an important point, I think, that we may talk in the discussion period, the appraisal of philosophical histories of science remains a familiar one. In other words, philosophical history of science has to be evaluated not from a philosophical perspective, but on the basis of the quality of historical narratives that it makes possible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Theodore, for your stimulating talk. I would now like to ask Hasok for his comments.
Thank you. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, because I had some trouble receiving, but I'm glad this direction is working okay. Good. So do tell me if there's any connection issues as I go. So thank you very much, Lucas, for having me here, and Theodore, for your wonderful talk. I'm not going to be a very good commentator in one sense, because I agree too much with the speaker. In fact, I cannot remember a single thing on which I've ever disagreed with Theodore Arabatzis about. So that's another story. But so what I'm going to try to do is not a critique or even provocation, but I'm going to try to build on what Theodore has said in a slightly different direction. So I take it that the key, the most central thing in the thinking that you presented today, Theodore, is the idea that meta-scientific concepts are both necessary and beneficial for the historiography of science. And that's a point I fully agree with. But let me pose a question concerning that point, which is the use of meta-scientific concepts particularly philosophical? I would say at least not so in the sense of being something that requires professional philosophical training that people such as myself have. And I say that because I think there are all kinds of meta-scientific concepts used by historians of science and by any historians, right? Think about things like notions of influence or interest or power, or injustice, performance. I mean, these are all meta-scientific concepts that are used routinely by historians of science, but they don't come from epistemology, right? They come from, as you mentioned, sociology, political science, economics, anthropology, and so on. So there's nothing actually particularly philosophical in the sense of the academic tribe that call ourselves philosophers in all of this. But then I want to flip that around and to argue that actually all of that is philosophy, right? In the sense that any critical and self-aware use of concepts and the reflections at a meta level on their use is philosophical thinking, right? So in that sense, right, I think thoughtful anthropologists are philosophers and thoughtful sociologists are philosophers and so on. And also there are many areas of philosophy, right? Not just epistemology. Historians of science, when they run from philosophy, think, no, we don't want that epistemological crap. But philosophy is also ethics, philosophy is also political philosophy, it is all kinds of other things, all the way to aesthetics. And there's just, I think we've had a very narrow view of what philosophy means in this debate about history and philosophy of science, and and I think we need to broaden that out. Now, there's a comment from somebody that streaming from me is not good.
I can hear and see you perfectly, so I think different people are, but it's
might
not
be
for connection.
We can never tell whether the problem is at the receiving end or the giving end or somewhere in the middle in the depth of Microsoft. Okay, I'll just carry on, and hopefully the recording comes through okay if people need to go back to. So I think there is a problem that within what we call philosophy of science, we have marginalized ethics and political philosophy and other areas of philosophy. And this is something that philosophers of science are beginning to fix, I'm glad to note. But we've still got a long way to go. So what I want to say after all that is that there is no reason for historians in general and historians of science particularly to avoid philosophy. And in this sense, there is, right, I would put it more positively, there's every reason for historians to embrace philosophy in this broader sense. And I believe that's the sense in which Ernest Geller, in his Plough, Sword and Book, said, I quote, "We are all of us philosophical historians, malgré nous, whether we wish it or not." I don't mean to wade into French, German history here, but that's what Gellner says to make that point. So that's my main point, but I think there'll be many of you who are not quite satisfied with that, because there is still a gulf, on the ground level at least, very much felt by many historians of science, the gulf along the old internalist, externalist divide rather, of how to do history of science. So I want to just offer two reflections, which I think can help bridge that gap. First, again, something that has been happening a lot in recent philosophy of science is that we are recognizing the place of values in science. And we're also recognizing that there is a very blurry boundary between epistemic and non-epistemic values, right? So the list of values, for example, that Theodore discussed from Kuhn, those are all supposed to be epistemic values, but when you start looking at, for example, things like simplicity, is that truly epistemic? It's at least not just epistemic, right? And then when we think about that further, I think this really destroys the idea of a philosophical history that's internalist, that's just focused on epistemology. Now, that line of work still does exist, and I spend most of my life doing it, but it's not so methodologically fundamentally different from other types of history of science, right? Which will make use of other types of meta-scientific concepts. And certainly this kind of epistemologically focused history of science is no better or worse than other types. It is just different. So that's the first reflection. The second one I offer in closing is to take a view of the internal-external distinction, not in the regular way, but from as conceived by Dudley Shapiro, right? Who says that what we should mean by internal is merely what has been internalized by the scientist, right? What they consider as properly part of scientific reasoning is what we should call internal, and the rest is external. Now, that means that the internal-external distinction doesn't clearly align with the divide between philosophical and non-philosophical history, because scientists do internalize all kinds of things in all kinds of different ways. That internal-external boundary is always shifting, and it doesn't come always at the expected place. And what I think is particularly useful is the fact that many concepts, take something like authority or replication or confirmation, they have dual aspects, that they have aspects that are internal, namely those aspects that scientists themselves consider as an essential part of how they make and judge knowledge. And then there are other aspects that are not, but that boundary is shifting and is blurry as well, right? So I think recognizing those 2 points would help us get over this persisting divide between the internal and external, and help us recognize the really productive role of Theodore's meta-scientific concepts in the doing of history. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Theodore, we have 5 or 6 minutes for your reply, if you will.
Yeah, I'll be brief. Because we have this problem with Hasok. We agree on too much. So what can one reply to something that one's agree with? But let me just comment on some of the points made by Hasok. The first is about the philosophical character of meta-scientific concepts, and I'd be happy to go along with what he suggests, that there are other meta-scientific concepts that have no obvious philosophical dimension, except in the very wide sense of critical commentary on the sciences. So in that sense, they are philosophical, and I would agree with that. But the meta-scientific concepts I focused on, it was deliberate on my part, are all concepts about which there is considerable philosophical discussion. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I find some aspects of that discussion very illuminating, not just from a philosophical point of view, but from a historiographical point of view. Now, the other point about philosophy of science not being just epistemology, again, that's an important point. I mean, Hasok mentioned, the ethics of science or political philosophy of science. One might add, I don't know, the metaphysics of science, mm-hmm. And look for insights there. Again, I'd be happy to extend the perspective to the philosophical perspective to these areas too. And if we look at the recent discussion about epistemic values, because the discussion has come a long way since Kuhn's days, mm-hmm. But I just wanted to give the audience a glimpse of into the discussion, choosing Kuhn because I consider him very, very important for the discussion, and it's a paper that is still cited widely in discussions on science and values, but it has become clear that it's difficult, if not altogether impossible, to draw a hard and fast distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values. Okay, Hasok mentioned simplicity. I mean, even in the philosophical community, I mean, in the community of philosophers of science, people like Bas van Frassen would not accept simplicity as an epistemic value. They think that it's a pragmatic value having to do with the users of scientific results, or those who evaluate scientific results, and have nothing to do with knowledge itself. But anyway, this is a long discussion. But even if we consider, for example, one of Kuhn's values, another of Kuhn's values, compatibility with background knowledge. Okay, I mean, this has come under fire from feminist philosophers of science because they think that that favors conservatism. Okay, and what if there are all kinds of problems in background knowledge? Then this wouldn't be a value; it would be a vice. If you wanted to have your current opinions to be compatible with what you supposedly already know. So again, I agree. I'm happy with this idea that there's no distinction between epistemic and non-epistemic values, and if there is no such distinction, at least not such an absolute distinction, then of course the one is obliged to reconsider the internalism-externalism distinction, right? Because if the line between the epistemic and the non-epistemic is not clear, I mean, it's not a straightforward thing to distinguish the two, then what's internal and what external becomes a very tricky issue. And Sapir, of course, is a good starting point. And I think it's a good starting point because it enables us at the same time to historicize the distinction, right? Because what is internalized by scientists differs across time. So as I mentioned in the talk, that in Newton's time, and if we look at the debate between Newton and Leibniz, theological arguments were internal to the debate. I mean, they didn't consider them irrelevant to the discussion on the stability of the solar system. Whereas from our point of view, I mean, these are totally external considerations. So again, I agree with Hasok, and let me on this. So I'll end here.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, thank you very much